June 2nd, 1944, 8:15 hours. A train clatters across the Mississippi River Bridge, its steel wheels grinding against the rails, pulling behind it a long chain of cars sealed shut. Inside, hundreds of German soldiers sit in silence. Just weeks ago, they were fighting for the Reich in North Africa and Italy. Now, their uniforms are stained, their faces hollow from weeks of captivity. They expect the worst. They believe they are being carried into punishment, starvation, or humiliation at the hands of their captors. They imagine prison camps surrounded by barbed wire, meager rations, and endless labor. For many, the image of America is still the propaganda they were fed at home, an enemy bent on their destruction. But what waits on the other side of the journey will confound every expectation. The United States Army, burdened with the responsibility of housing nearly 425,000 Axis prisoners of war by the war's end, does something few on either side anticipated. It treats them not as nameless enemies, but as human beings. Spread across 700 camps in 46 states, German POWs discover a strange and bewildering truth. Captivity in America can feel like a reprieve from the war itself. The first surprise comes in the form of food. From the moment prisoners disembark from trains into camps built in the heartland, Kansas, Texas, Georgia, and beyond, they are issued meals that defy belief. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread, steaming coffee, meat several times a week. In 1943, while rationing grips the civilian population, the U.S. Army allocates POWs 3,200 calories per day, mirroring the rations of American GIs. By contrast, many German civilians back home survive on barely half that amount. "We ate like kings," one captured infantryman would later recall. It was more than we ever had, even in the best years before the war. Behind the barbed wire, daily life takes on an almost surreal rhythm. Prisoners wake to reveille, roll call, and work details. But those details are not forced labor in mines or quarries, as feared. Instead, most are trucked out to neighboring farms or lumber mills. America, its agricultural workforce drained by enlistment, relies on POW labor to bring in crops and cut timber. In 1944 alone, German prisoners logged more than 45 million man-days of work, saving American farmers from ruin. A prisoner earns 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, redeemable for tobacco, soap, or chocolate. For men who expected starvation, the chance to buy a Hershey bar feels almost unreal. Some of the most telling moments unfold in the letters home. Every week, censors clear stacks of mail bound for Bremen, Hamburg, and Munich. Again and again, POWs reassure their families, "We are treated well." "Do not worry," one lieutenant captured at Kasserine Pass writes, "it is as though we are guests here. There is food, there is work, there is music. Do not believe what they say of the Americans." His words, carried across the Atlantic, astonish families struggling amid air raids and rationing. Not all is ease. The camps are still prisons, encircled by high fences, guard towers, and armed sentries. Escape attempts do occur. In Texas, 2 prisoners tunnel beneath the wire, surviving for days before capture. In Arizona, a group of U-boat sailors march into the desert, only to surrender from thirst. Yet these attempts are rare, and fewer still are violent. The prisoners understand an unspoken truth: life inside the wire is often safer and far more comfortable than the uncertainty of war-torn Europe. From the guard towers, young American sentries often stare in disbelief. They are scarcely older than the men they watch. Some guards are farm boys from Nebraska or Alabama. Others are first-generation sons of German immigrants themselves. Over time, the hostility softens. Stories circulate of guards slipping cigarettes to their charges or farmers inviting POWs into their kitchens for Sunday meals. Regulations prohibit such fraternization, but in small towns across America, humanity bends the rules. The cultural exchange flows in both directions. German prisoners teach language classes, stage theater productions, even form orchestras, using instruments provided by the YMCA and the Red Cross. In Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a choir of POWs sings Bach before an audience of American officers. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, prisoners build elaborate stage sets for a play. When the curtain rises, their captors laugh and applaud. In these unlikely moments, art bridges the divide between enemy and enemy. Numbers tell the larger story. In 1945, nearly 1 out of every 7 U.S. counties hosts a POW camp or branch facility. From California's San Joaquin Valley to the forests of Maine, German soldiers harvest crops, fell trees, and process lumber. They drive tractors, mend fences, and haul grain. At the height of the harvest season, as many as 30,000 POWs are deployed in Midwestern fields. Their efficiency keeps wheat production steady at 1.1 billion bushels in 1944, despite millions of American men overseas. In return, the prisoners earn both wages and dignity. "It was honest work," recalls one Wehrmacht sergeant. "It felt as though we were needed, not just forgotten behind fences." Some townsfolk view the arrangement with suspicion, even anger. Headlines accuse the government of pampering the enemy. In communities where rationing bites deep, seeing German soldiers eat white bread and butter stirs resentment. Yet farmers who rely on their labor argue otherwise. "They saved our harvest," one Iowa farmer later testifies. "Without them, the fields would have rotted." There are darker currents, too. Among the prisoners are die-hard Nazis, men still sworn to Hitler. They police their fellow captives with threats, intimidation, even violence. In Camp Tonkawa, 1943, a German prisoner suspected of disloyalty is beaten and lynched by his comrades. American authorities crack down, segregating hardline Nazis from others. By 1944, a system of classification emerges: white for compliant, gray for uncertain, black for dangerous ideologues. In many camps, the whites and grays begin to drift away from the black core, quietly grateful for a chance at respite. By war's end, more than 371,000 German POWs will pass through America's heartland. Many will carry home not bitterness, but bewildering memories of kindness. Some will return after the war, immigrating to the country that once held them captive. For them, the barbed wire was less a cage than a curtain, separating one life from another, dividing despair from an unexpected glimpse of hope. In the spring of 1945, as the Reich collapses and Allied armies push into Berlin, men behind American fences listen to news broadcasts with disbelief. They hear of cities leveled, families scattered, a nation in ruins. And then they look around, their bellies full, their bodies clothed, their captors treating them with respect. A prisoner at Camp Swift, Texas, writes in his journal, "We are the defeated. But here I feel more human than I ever did in uniform. The paradox is inescapable. Defeat has brought not degradation, but unexpected dignity." For the German soldier in American hands, the war is over. And in its ending, he finds something his own homeland could no longer give: peace, safety, and, most strangely of all, hospitality. August 17th, 1945. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The war is over. News spreads first in whispers, then in jubilant shouts from the guard towers. Japan has surrendered. For the Americans, victory is complete. For the German prisoners behind the wire, a new uncertainty takes hold. They survived the war. They survived captivity. Now they wonder, what comes next? The Geneva Convention had promised repatriation as soon as possible after the cessation of hostilities. Yet in practice it is anything but swift. Ships are scarce. Europe is shattered. Millions of displaced persons crowd roads and rail lines. And so, tens of thousands of Germans remain in American camps for months, even years, after the guns fall silent. The waiting gives rise to something unexpected. A second life inside captivity, a world less of war and more of reflection. American officials begin to see opportunity in the delay. The Office of War Information, in coordination with the Army, launches re-education programs designed to erode Nazi ideology and prepare prisoners for democratic life. In lecture halls built from barracks, POWs attend classes on American history, world literature, and the principles of constitutional government. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, they pore over translations of the Federalist Papers. In Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, they debate the meaning of liberty. Thousands of copies of German-language newspapers, produced under American supervision, circulate through the camps, carrying editorials condemning Hitler's regime and introducing the values of free press. Not all prisoners embrace the effort. Die-hard Nazis sneer at the Umerziehung, the re-education. Some tear up the papers in contempt. Yet many others, especially younger soldiers conscripted in the war's later years, find themselves intrigued. "We were told America was brutal and greedy," one private later recalled. But here we read about Lincoln and Jefferson. We saw another picture of freedom. For men whose youth had been swallowed by totalitarianism, the idea of another path takes root. Meanwhile, daily life grows more varied, more human. Camps host soccer tournaments, drawing crowds of guards and locals alike. Prisoner orchestras expand, playing Beethoven and Brahms for audiences that sometimes include townsfolk invited inside. In one Arkansas camp, POWs build a small theater, complete with painted backdrops and wooden seating, and perform comedies that make both captors and captives laugh until tears roll. Even baseball, alien at first to German eyes, finds its way into the barracks yards. By 1946, some prisoners field full teams, swinging bats in borrowed uniforms, running bases under the hot American sun. Letters from this period show a shift in tone. Early assurances of survival give way to something more startling: gratitude. A corporal in Oklahoma writes to his parents, "I must tell you, I will miss the food when I go. We eat meat, potatoes, and milk every day. They even allow us to buy beer." It is a strange captivity, almost like a holiday from war. Another writes, "They teach us English. They let us listen to music. They do not humiliate us. It is not what we expected. It is not what we were told." The statistics remain astonishing. In 1945, the U.S. government spends over $100 million annually on the maintenance of German POWs. The prisoners consume 15 million pounds of meat, 10 million pounds of flour, and nearly 5 million pounds of sugar in that year alone. Each camp functions like a small town, with kitchens, hospitals, libraries, and even barbershops run in part by the prisoners themselves. The abundance stands in jarring contrast to Germany, where hunger stalks every family and children scrape for coal among the rubble of bombed cities. Farmers continue to rely heavily on POW labor even after the war. With the draft still pulling men overseas until demobilization, agricultural demand does not ease. In Kansas alone, 1945 records show 20,000 German prisoners bringing in the wheat harvest. In Texas, they pick cotton by the bale. For their work, they still earn coupons redeemable at the camp canteens. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, little luxuries that transform captivity into something unexpectedly comfortable. There is irony in this generosity. American civilians at home remain subject to rationing until late 1945. Butter, sugar, meat, all limited. Yet behind barbed wire, enemy soldiers dine with a consistency few households could match. Tensions sometimes flare. In Alabama, local newspapers complain that Nazis eat steak while our boys make do. In the Midwest, mothers writing letters to Congress demand answers. But military officials remain firm. The Geneva Convention must be upheld. And quietly, there is another motive. showing captured Germans a standard of living far beyond what Nazi propaganda ever admitted. The transformation is not universal. In certain camps, Nazi hardliners still attempt to enforce their will, marking fellow prisoners as traitors if they appear too friendly with Americans. But by late 1945, the tide has shifted. Prisoners classified white and gray vastly outnumber the ideological black. The majority begin to look beyond Hitler, beyond the Reich, toward futures not yet imagined. For many, captivity has become not a punishment, but an education in what life might be after fascism. For the guards and nearby civilians, the POWs become familiar figures. In small towns across the South and Midwest, locals remember German work crews arriving in trucks, filing into fields, then returning hours later with shirts damp with sweat. Farmers' children wave. Some prisoners, sketching in notebooks, capture the endless horizons of the Great Plains or the tall pine forests of the South. Decades later, those sketches would resurface in family homes across Germany, reminders of a captivity that was at once confining and strangely expansive. By 1946, the repatriation begins in earnest. Ships carry tens of thousands of men back across the Atlantic, first to England or France, then into the shattered remains of Germany. Many disembarked to scenes of devastation they could scarcely imagine, cities in ruins, families broken apart, food scarce. And in that moment, the memories of American camps take on an even sharper edge. Some men speak openly. I was fed better as a prisoner than my family is now. Others fall silent, unable to reconcile the abundance they left behind with the desolation awaiting them. For a significant number, the experience leaves an indelible mark. When immigration restrictions ease in the late 1940s and 1950s, former POWs return, not as captives, but as settlers. They take up farming in Wisconsin, engineering in Ohio, teaching in Texas. They bring with them memories of breadlines in the camps, of laughter at makeshift theaters, of guards who treated them as men rather than enemies. Their children grow up American, their father's captivity a strange and distant origin story. As the last prisoners leave American soil in 1946, a quiet paradox lingers. In the greatest war of the 20th century, defeat brought many German soldiers not humiliation, but dignity, not suffering, but safety. For them, the United States was both enemy and sanctuary, captor and benefactor. The barbed wire had been real, but behind it they found not the nightmare they had feared, but a vision of a different world, one they would carry with them long after the gates swung open. March 3rd, 1955. Bremen Harbor, a freighter from New Orleans docks, and among the passengers are men who once wore field gray uniforms, then prison garb, then work clothes in far-off American fields. They step onto German soil again after years abroad, not as soldiers, not as prisoners, but as men forever changed by captivity in the United States. The war has ended, but its shadows still stretch across two continents, and in those shadows, a quiet legacy takes root. The story of German prisoners who returned home with unexpected memories of kindness, abundance, and dignity. In Germany, the devastation is still plain. Cities are rebuilding brick by brick. Families live among ruins. Food shortages stretch well into the early 1950s. Against this backdrop, former POWs begin to tell their stories. Around kitchen tables and in crowded beer halls, they speak of meals that never ran out, of work that gave them purpose, of guards who treated them with respect. At first, many Germans listen in disbelief. How could their sworn enemy, the Americans, have been so generous when their own homeland was still rationing bread? The answer lies in the numbers. Between 1942 and 1946, 371,000 German POWs cycled through camps across the United States. Another 100,000 spent time in Britain, Canada, or elsewhere. but none experienced captivity quite like those sent to the American interior. They worked more than 45 million man-days in agriculture alone, producing food that fed the very nation that held them captive. They consumed thousands of tons of meat, milk, bread, and sugar. They staged nearly 2,000 theatrical productions, from operas to comedies, while their countrymen back home scoured rubble for coal. The contrast was staggering and unforgettable. Some carried home more than memories. In pockets and packs they brought small tokens, drawings of barns and prairies, baseball gloves gifted by guards, sheet music from camp orchestras. A few even brought English phrases picked up in classrooms or on farms that they would later teach their children. Decades afterward, those children, now grown, would recall their fathers peppering German conversations with American slang, a living trace of years spent behind barbed wire that had not felt like a cage. The long-term impact unfolded slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Former POWs wrote memoirs, many published in the 1960s and 70s, that painted their captivity not in tones of bitterness, but of wonder. One memoirist confessed, "I could not believe my luck. In defeat, I found freedom." Another reflected, "I learned more about democracy in 1 year in Texas than in all my schooling in Germany." These accounts surprised American readers too, who had assumed the prisoners had been little more than burdens. Instead, they discovered that their nation's adherence to the Geneva Convention had seeded goodwill in the very hearts of those once sworn to destroy it. Back in the United States, the legacy was just as tangible. Farmers remembered the men who saved their harvests during wartime labor shortages. Children remembered waving to the prisoners trucked into fields each morning. In some towns, decades later, reunions were held when former POWs returned as tourists, seeking out the camps that had once confined them. Local families welcomed them back, not as enemies, but as old acquaintances. In Iowa, a group of German veterans visited in 1989, meeting the farmers they had worked beside in 1945. One remarked, "It is strange. I feel I am coming home." Not every memory was rosy. Some prisoners remained embittered, especially those intimidated by Nazi hardliners in the camps. Others resented the delay in repatriation, remembering months of waiting when they longed for home. Yet even among these voices, a recurring admission emerges. Their captors had not starved them, had not beaten them, had not humiliated them. For men conditioned to expect brutality, even fairness felt like mercy. By the mid-20th century, the story of German POWs in America entered the wider cultural memory. Historians compiled records, 700 camps across 46 states, housing soldiers who harvested wheat, picked cotton, cut timber, and canned food. Documentaries featured footage of prisoners laughing on baseball fields, marching into orchards, playing violins in makeshift orchestras. Newspapers revisited the paradox: enemy soldiers who, in captivity, found security their own families lacked. The numbers fade with time, but the human stories endure. A man who once fought at Kasserine Pass settles in Wisconsin, opening a dairy farm not far from where he had once labored as a POW. Another, who spent years at Camp Swift in Texas, returns in the 1960s as an engineer for a German car company, marveling at the highways he first glimpsed as a prisoner. Their children grow up as citizens of a world where yesterday's enemies became today's neighbors. By the 1980s and 90s, many of those former prisoners had grown old. Some returned to America one last time, visiting cemeteries where comrades who died in captivity were buried under neat rows of white crosses. Standing among them, they remembered not fear, but a strange peace. "Here," one said softly, "we learned to live again." The paradox lingered. The war that had brought ruin also delivered in defeat an unexpected vision of a better life. The story of the German POWs in America is not one of heroics on the battlefield, nor of grand strategy in command tents. It is instead a quieter story, measured in meals served, fields harvested, songs sung in barracks under the watch of armed sentries. It is a story of men discovering that their captors could show humanity even in war's darkest hour. And it is a story of how that humanity rippled outward, across oceans, across decades, planting seeds of understanding where once there had been only enmity. In the end, the statistics speak clearly. Nearly 425,000 Axis prisoners passed through the United States. They worked, they ate, they wrote letters home, and most returned not with hatred, but with memories that defied the expectations of both propaganda and fear. The war had made them enemies. Captivity had made them witnesses to another way of life. The narrator's voice lowers, steady, reflective. In the great sweep of World War II, millions perished, cities burned, and nations fell. Yet, inside the barbed wire compounds scattered across America, thousands of German soldiers experienced something wholly unexpected. In defeat, they found dignity. In captivity, they found safety. And in the heart of their enemy's homeland, they found, strangest of all, hospitality. June 6, 1994, Normandy, France. The beaches are crowded again, but not with soldiers storming through smoke and fire. Instead, veterans gather to remember. Among the gray-haired Americans who once fought ashore, a small group of Germans stand quietly. They too were part of the war, but their memories do not end in blood. For them, the story detoured into the heart of the United States, where captivity revealed not cruelty, but humanity. Now, 5 decades later, they return not as enemies, but as witnesses to a strange chapter in history. The Cold War has long since reshaped the world. Germany is divided, America stands as a superpower, and NATO binds former enemies into new alliances. Yet the memories of German POWs in the United States echo beneath these changes. Many of those men, when asked why they viewed America differently than the Soviet Union or even Britain, point back to their time behind the wire. They recall the bread that never stopped, the guards who treated them fairly, the work that gave them dignity. For them, America became not just the conqueror, but a model. These experiences, carried home, helped lay quiet groundwork for reconciliation between nations that once tried to destroy one another. The statistics are clear. By the 1950s, thousands of ex-POWs had emigrated back to the U.S., joining its farms, its factories, its classrooms. They became part of the very country that once imprisoned them. Their children, raised in American towns, grew up bilingual, bicultural, living proof of how swiftly enemies could become neighbors. In Germany, those who stayed shared stories of captivity so at odds with propaganda that they spread a counter-narrative, one that painted America as both formidable and fair. In classrooms, memoirs were read aloud. In beer halls, laughter followed recollections of baseball games played behind barbed wire. Piece by piece, suspicion gave way to grudging respect and, in many cases, admiration. There is a deeper lesson here. Warfare dehumanizes. It strips away individuality, turning men into uniforms, numbers, casualties. Yet within the fences of American POW camps, humanity persisted, sometimes in a hot meal, sometimes in a loaf of bread handed over a counter, sometimes in music drifting through a barracks on a summer evening. These moments, small in themselves, carried immense weight. They reminded men who had been taught to hate that dignity could exist even in the hands of an enemy. For many, it was their first glimpse of democracy, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality. The paradox remains striking. At the very height of history's most destructive war, a nation chose not to crush its captives, but to uphold their rights. The cost was not insignificant. Hundreds of millions of dollars in food, shelter, and labor administration. Yet the return on that investment was measured in something more lasting than currency: trust. By treating their captives with fairness, the United States planted seeds that would, decades later, bloom into alliances, partnerships, and a shared belief in rebuilding rather than revenge. The camera, in the mind's eye, moves from Normandy's beaches to the plains of Kansas, to the cotton fields of Texas, to the pine forests of Minnesota. It lingers on the ghostly outlines of camps long since dismantled, where barbed wire once cut across the land. Today, only faint traces remain: concrete foundations, fading photographs, aging diaries. Yet in memory, the fences are still there, and behind them, the laughter of young men who discovered that captivity could feel like freedom. A former prisoner once wrote, "We lost the war, but in America I learned how to live." Another, decades later, told his grandchildren, "The best bread I ever ate was baked in a prison camp in Arkansas." These voices echo still, testaments to the enduring irony. Defeat had delivered them not to despair, but to unexpected mercy. The documentary closes not with gunfire, not with marching boots, but with the quieter rhythm of life, the turning of soil in American fields, the notes of a violin played in a barracks, the creak of a ship carrying men homeward across the Atlantic. And in the silence that follows, one truth remains. For the German soldier who became a prisoner in America, the war's strangest gift was not survival alone, but the discovery that even in the harshest of conflicts, humanity can endure, and in rare cases, hospitality can be found on the other side of the wire.